So this is the last footage I have left over from 2019, so it is an older project. Right at the tail end of 2019, I made a wine box, and this was another one of those great projects where the design was left to me. There's a lot of easy ways to do this, and I kept it fairly simple, but made it a little bit different than some of the stuff I've seen out there. So I started by milling up some scrap cherry and some scrap walnut. These are going to be the two lumbers that make up the base of the box. I just wanted to get them both at the same size and then rip them down to a proper height. So the bottle that is going in this box, someone gave me the dimensions. It's a little bit different than an average size wine bottle, so I just made it large enough that some packing material could fit in there. So you had a little bit of wiggle room, and so that is what those dimensions are based on. But if you're making something like this, you could just measure your bottle and then go with that. So it was about, because I'm putting a lid on it, a little over 5 inches tall, and then a little over 13 inches long, as well as about 5 inches wide. So I'm just cutting down those pieces, and the two edges are going to be cherry, which is what I'm cutting now, and the front ends are going to be walnut. It just creates a nice sense of style without having to do a ton of detailing work. So the main detail I'm putting in this box is I'm going to be joining it with finger joints, which once again is a great way to add some aesthetic to a piece by choosing joinery and then contrasting the two woods. It just gives a nice clean look, and cherry and walnut finish really well, so it will be extremely aesthetically appealing. So I have this dovetail cutting jig, which I use for pretty much all of my dovetails. It's a cheap knockoff from Harbor Freight, which I mention all the time. And once you get these dialed in, they'll cut really nice joints. Sometimes I'll get a little bit of tear out in the front, but it's not a huge deal because that front edge will get hidden within the joint. So I always have a link. I believe there's a link in this description where I saw the video on how to set these things up, because they can be very finicky, but once you dial it in, the repeatability on them is just really good. So I cut my two tops, and then I'll cut the two bottoms to fit the pieces in place. Now usually when doing this, I'm making drawers, so I'm only putting dovetails in the front. So I made sure to cut the two tops and the two bottoms at separate times so I didn't mess up the joints. So then the bottom's just going to get a piece of 1/4 inch plywood, which in actuality is more like 3/32, and so I'm just ripping a little groove in the bottom. I'm using a 1/4 inch Dado stack because the plywood is almost a 1/4 inch. It'll give it some room to move around in there in case the box decides to shrink or swell. So then I'm going to be putting a sliding lid on the top, so on one of my ends I'm completely cutting off the top edge of the piece. I'm putting that groove on the top and the bottom. I didn't mention that earlier because the bottom will get plywood and the top is going to get a sliding edge. It's the exact same groove set off the bottom and the top the exact same distance, so it's about the groove will start at about a 1/2 inch up. Once I have that, I can glue this whole thing together. So you can see those dovetails are a nice tight fit, and with the glue in there, this will pretty much never come apart. And then I'll use a hammer to really get those joints flush and straight so I don't have a ton of sanding to do, and then clean up the glue afterwards. So this is one of those projects where it's important to have it square, but it's not as important as making drawer boxes. So what I did was I glued up the end, and then I measured for the bottom piece. I could slide that into place, and then I could glue up the front. So you could see how that panel can float now in the bottom, and that is a nicer grade of plywood. I believe it was a birch veneer ply, so it's already pretty close to being finished. It won't have a lot of knots or anything in it, so it will match the box nicely. Could put the glue on all of my edges and then connect this whole thing. So like I said before, square isn't as important, but I obviously want it very close to square because it's going to be getting a sliding lid, and if it's not square, that sliding lid will not slide into place the way you want it to. So you can see that I have that groove along the entire top edge as well. And then there will be just a slight bit of sanding to do. You can see there's some burnout on the top. I really need to sharpen my table saw blade. So I'm just going to clean that up with a belt sander. And the nice thing about planing wood is the planer that I have, the DeWalt, will give you a really nice finish right off the bat, right off the planer. So there usually isn't a ton of sanding to do on the planed wood in my shop, which is nice because no one likes sanding. But I'll just clean up the edges really quick. And I always sand a little bit and then wait to do finish sanding till the end, and I usually don't film it. So the top of this is going to be a piece of spalted maple. Again, a nice contrasting lumber to the cherry and the walnut. And since it's spalted, it will have also some texture and pattern to it as well. So for the top, I wanted to do something a little different, and I decided to make a raised panel out of it. So I went through and cut rabbets on the two edges that are thick enough to slide into my groove, which I said is a little less than 1/4 of an inch. So I needed to add those rabbets on 3 of my sides. So I have a sacrificial fence in my table saw. I'm cutting about a 1/4 inch groove because the groove in the side of my panels is about a 1/4 inch deep. And then I could test that fit. It was a little tight at first, so I went through and made the groove a little bit bigger, but you could see now it slides in and out fairly nicely. Once I added some wax and fine-tuned it, I cleaned up, there was some glue at the 2 edges I cleaned up, it fit in there very nicely. And then I left it long so I could just trim off the edge. You can see now I'm adding some wax, and after I added the wax, this slid in and out of the box very nicely. That wax just really reduces the friction in the lumber. And if you have a drawer, an old wooden drawer, set of drawers that sticks, and quick easy fix usually is just adding some wax to the rails, then it will slide nicely. So I'm marking the depth on the top of the box panel now that it fits, so I know where to cut my grooves. So I usually use my tall fence for this, but this piece of wood is fairly short. So I'm just adding a slide on the top of my fence that I could attach my panel to, and I have about a 10-degree tilt on my table saw blade with the feather board in place, and I can just slide that panel on the top of my fence and cut the slits on the edges. So you can see that first one, and then I could just flip it over, reattach that fence, slide it through. This is a nice, safe way to do this. Sometimes if your panel's too small, if you use that tall fence, it's a little hard to send it through because your hands are so far down on the fence. So then when I'm flipping it to upside, I'm using the tall fence because it's a safer cut. Same process, I have that slider on the top I could clamp my piece to, readjust my fence to get it just about right, and then slide the piece through. The tall fence is great with that piece of wood on the top, because if you can't really use a zero clearance insert in the saw, and if you don't have it attached to something, once you cut that raised panel, it's going to want to sink into the opening in your faceplate there. So once that was done, once again I have some burn marks, so I was just sanding those off. You're left with a nice detail on top. Like I said, I don't show a ton of sanding because it's kind of boring. This is how that box will slide into place. So it slides easily enough, and there's enough of a grip on the top. I didn't put any sort of handles or anything on it. And I didn't film finishing this, but I just put 3 coats of general finishes on it. The customer was kind enough to send me some pictures. So this is from their home. This was the finished box.